Dust swirled. John signed the final paper. He grinned, accepting the keys from the old farmer, Jebediah. Jebediah, eyes clouded with years, didn't smile back. He clutched a worn, leather-bound book to his chest. "You got a good price, Jeb," John said, clapping the old man on the shoulder. Jebediah flinched, his gaze darting to the farmhouse looming behind them. It stood desolate, windows like vacant eyes. John turned, admiring his purchase. He dreamt of restoring the farm, breathing life back into the fields. He didn't notice Jebediah's lingering gaze, a silent plea in his rheumy eyes. "Don't stay past dark," Jebediah rasped, his voice a dry wind through dead leaves. John chuckled, waving him off as he climbed into his truck. The engine roared to life, drowning out Jebediah's final unheard warning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the fields. John unpacked boxes in the dusty farmhouse. He found Jebediah's book beneath a floorboard. The leather was cold, almost damp in his hands. He opened it. The pages were filled with frantic, spidery handwriting. John skimmed the entries, a chill crawling down his spine. Jebediah wrote of strange occurrences, shadows moving in the fields, whispers on the wind. He wrote of a darkness that clung to the land, a hunger that lingered. John scoffed, tossing the book aside. "Just old man ramblings," he thought. He glanced out the window. The wind rustled the cornfields, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching him. He shook his head, attributing it to his imagination. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet. The house was settling, he told himself. He ignored the feeling of unease that settled over him, heavy as a shroud. Days turned into weeks. John worked tirelessly, repairing fences, tilling the land. He pushed aside the strange occurrences that plagued him, the whispers in the dead of night, footsteps in the hall when he was alone, the feeling of being watched, always watched. One evening, while mending a fence, he saw her, a young woman in a white dress, her face obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. She stood silently at the edge of the field, her form wavering in the heat haze. John approached her, heart pounding. "Hello!" he called out. The figure didn't move. As he drew closer, she vanished, leaving behind only the rustling of the cornstalks. John stared at the empty field, a cold dread seeping into his bones. That night the whispers grew louder, morphing into unintelligible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Sleep eluded him. He lay awake, listening to the sounds of the old farmhouse groaning around him like a living thing in pain. The harvest moon hung heavy in the sky, casting an eerie silver light over the land. John stood on his porch, a sense of foreboding gripping him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. He grabbed his flashlight, the metal cold against his clammy palm. He walked towards the barn, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. He swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. Just the endless rows of cornstalks swaying ominously in the night breeze. As he rounded the corner of the barn, he stopped dead in his tracks. Scratched into the wooden siding illuminated by his flashlight were 3 words, "Leave while you can." The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He spun around, searching the darkness for the source of the message, but he was alone. Fear, sharp and cold, shot through him. He ran back to the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He slammed the door shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty house. He leaned against the door, gasping for breath, his mind racing. The unseen guest. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind sent shivers down his spine. He sat in the flickering lamplight, Jebediah's journal open in his lap. He reread the frantic scrawls, his blood turning to ice. Jebediah wrote of his family, driven mad by the whispers, by the shadows that moved in the night. He wrote of his wife, found drowned in the well, her eyes wide with terror. He wrote of his son, vanished without a trace, his laughter forever echoing in the empty fields. A blood-curdling scream split the night. John jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He grabbed a rusty scythe from the wall, its blade glinting in the dim light. He crept towards the source of the scream, each step heavy with dread. The scream had come from the kitchen. He slowly pushed open the door, his breath catching in his throat. The room was in disarray, chairs overturned, dishes smashed on the floor, but there was no one there. He was alone, or so he thought. He felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, an icy finger trailing down his spine. He whirled around, scythe raised, but there was nothing there. Only the echo of his own fear bouncing off the walls. Harvest of fear. Days blurred into a horrifying montage of terror. The whispers intensified, morphing into distinct voices, chanting his name, beckoning him into the darkness. The shadows in the cornfields grew bolder, taking on grotesque shapes that seemed to mock his fear. He tried to leave to escape the nightmare that had ensnared him, but some unseen force held him captive. His truck wouldn't start, its engine sputtering and dying. The phone lines were dead. He was trapped. He barricaded himself inside the farmhouse, boarding up the windows, piling furniture against the doors. He huddled in the center of the living room, clutching Jebediah's journal like a lifeline. The house groaned and shuddered around him, as if something was trying to get in. Then, silence. An eerie, unsettling silence. The whispers ceased. The shadows retreated. John held his breath, every muscle in his body tense, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Whispers in the night. A soft scratching sound came from the basement door. John's blood ran cold. He had nailed that door shut himself. He watched in horror as the nails were slowly, deliberately pulled out from the other side. The door creaked open. A single skeletal hand emerged from the darkness, its bony fingers scrabbling at the floorboards. Then another hand, followed by a figure crawling slowly, painfully, out of the basement. It was the woman in the white dress. Her dress was tattered, stained with what looked like blood. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow and black. She fixed her gaze on John, a chilling smile spreading across her lips. John stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He raised the scythe, his hand trembling. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The woman continued to crawl towards him, her movements jerky and unnatural. "We've been waiting for you," she whispered, her voice a dry, rustling sound. "This farm, it needs a new caretaker." She lunged at him, her skeletal fingers reaching for him. Blood on the scythe. John screamed, swinging the scythe blindly. He felt it connect with something soft, heard a sickening thud. The woman crumpled to the floor, her body contorting at an unnatural angle. He scrambled back, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. The woman lay still. John stared down at her, his stomach churning. He had killed her. He had killed a woman. But as he stared at her lifeless form, a horrifying realization dawned on him. The woman's face, though twisted in a silent scream, seemed oddly familiar. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently removed the wide-brimmed hat that covered her head. His blood ran cold. It was his wife who had died 10 years ago, his wife who had always hated the countryside, who had begged him not to buy this farm, his wife whose last words to him had been a chilling premonition: "This place will be the death of you." The truth revealed. John stumbled back, his mind fracturing under the weight of the revelation. He looked down at Jebediah's journal, which lay open on the floor. His eyes fell on a passage he hadn't noticed before. "The land, it hungers," Jebediah had written. "It takes what it wants, twisting love into obsession, grief into madness. It feeds on our pain, our fear. And it offers a cruel solace, a chance to be reunited with the ones we've lost. But the price is too high." John finally understood. The farm wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was something far older, far more insidious, something that preyed on vulnerable souls, offering them a twisted version of their heart's desire. And he, in his grief, in his desperation for a fresh start, had walked right into its trap. He glanced at his wife's lifeless body. She looked peaceful now, almost happy. But he knew the truth. This wasn't his wife. It was a hollow imitation, a puppet animated by the malevolent force that ruled this land. The cycle continues. A cold, calculating calm settled over John. He knew what he had to do. He picked up Jebediah's journal and walked out of the farmhouse. He looked back at the land that had promised him peace, that had offered him a chance to escape his grief. Now it offered him nothing but despair. He set fire to the farmhouse, watching as the flames consumed the building, licking at the night sky. He walked away without looking back, Jebediah's journal clutched tightly in his hand. He would dedicate the rest of his life to warning others, to breaking the cycle of death and madness that plagued this cursed land. He didn't notice the figure watching him from the edge of the cornfield. A young couple, their faces filled with hope and excitement, stood hand in hand. They had just purchased the farm from a weary old man who had warned them about the dangers, who had pleaded with them to leave. But they, blinded by their dreams, didn't listen. The cycle continues.